this is updates for September 1, 2022, day 190 of the war, end of the date update. We're gonna continue focus on Kherson bridgehead, as this is the most important development, recent development in this war. So we're gonna do walks through the front line, and then once we reach Kherson bridgehead, we'll do deep dive there. One side note is that there is some information from Russian sources that Ukrainian commanders tried to land near Enerhodar and capture a nuclear power station. We believe it's all total fake. There's no military logic, no any kind of logic to do that action. It's just suicidal mission that doesn't make any kind of sense. There's another sort of general update. Our Russian sources again continuing the stories that Ukrainian troops are trying to launch some kind of offensive to the east of Kharkiv in this border region. We don't believe this is sort of in the making by any means. At the same time, what we're seeing is that the front line here on Izyum bridgehead is getting somewhat closer to the town of Izyum itself. This is from reports from the local population that they hear cannonade from the artillery shelling more sort of pronounced than they used to have it before. Beyond that, we don't believe that Ukrainian forces are capable of doing two simultaneous offensives. Even the offensive on Kherson bridgehead is extremely poorly executed, but there are other powerful sources on Ukrainian side that allow it to happen, specifically those HIMARS rocket systems, but that's not the only thing. We'll discuss it a little bit later once we get there. So now let's start in a clockwise fashion from the very north. There was, as always, exchange of artillery fire, all sort of action, commandos actions along the state border. It seems like it's heating up a little bit more relative to sort of past, 5 days ago or 4 days ago, but that's sort of call it normal, given the whole tension that's coming from the Kherson bridgehead. Now let's move to Kharkiv area. Here things were pretty quiet in terms of there were no infantry attacks, not even any sort of attacks, not even probing attacks at all. So just exchange of artillery fire. Now let's move south. Let's see what's going on Izyum bridgehead. Here things also were essentially quiet, and the only place was this village Krasnopilya and Dolina. Apparently, we believe this is just a probing, screening attack by Russian troops. There was with no sort of real intent there. Now let's move to North Donbass section of the front line, where it's used to be the also main area of sort of fighting. It's fairly quiet here in the most northern section. There were some relatively weak attacks in Soledar and Bakhmut. They didn't go anywhere. It was just more kind of keep Ukrainian troops on their toes, and that's pretty much what it was about. Similar situation with Saladalina and Zaitsevo. The only meaningful and sort of focused attack is in this village Kadama, where Russian troops, specifically Wagner mercenaries, still trying to squeeze out Ukrainian forces, and where that are essentially on the western outskirts of the village. But we didn't hear any progress or the sort of final, that Russian troops finally managed to squeeze completely Ukrainian forces. Now let's move south. Let's see what's going on west of Donetsk. Things here sort of as usual, nothing really new here. Attacks out of Pisky area in all directions. And we'll quickly look once we get to the detailed map. Then attack towards Marinka and attack a little bit north of Vuhledar at the village Vodyane. Let's actually quickly recap what's going on here around Piski. So the attacks are like sort of typical directions, right? Vodyane, Snaza Vodyane. Then the main attack towards Pervomaiske, then also towards Nevelske, which essentially should help Pervomaiske eventually, and also probing attack at Open. So typical areas, nothing really new here. Now let's quickly check what's going on Zaporizhia front line. Things here are pretty quiet, just artillery fire. That's some reconnaissance action, but nothing really major here going on. Now let's actually move to Kherson bridgehead and let's look what's going on here. So first of all, Ukrainian troops continue attacking their bridges to keep the supply lines as severed as possible. So they not only attacking the bridges, they're attacking pontoon bridges, ferries, everything they can reach. The attacks are continuing non-stop so far. We're pretty sure that this is definitely creating problems for the Russian command and Russian troops on the Kherson bridgehead in terms of being able to resupply. So this is sort of the major reason why Ukrainian troops are able to launch this counteroffensive is that FIMAR system destroyed the bridges and severed to significant degree resupply of Russian troops in terms of ammunition and even in terms of reserves, actual fresh replacements. So essentially, that's all almost impossible at this point. The other significant development that we actually didn't discuss, but it was happening past like about 10 days, is that Ukrainian Air Forces received anti-radar rockets from I think US and UK. They called HARM rockets, and so they basically destroyed a lot of Russian radars and anti-air systems, which essentially cleared up sort of skies over the Kherson bridgehead for Ukrainian air forces, not to the extent that Ukrainian air forces can do whatever they want, but now we see that Bayraktar's UAVs are back up in the air. And we discussed this in the past that they are pretty weak in terms of they could be easily picked up by anti-air systems. We're not talking about man-held, which is like sort of normal, sort of call it industrial systems or whatever you call it. But so now they operating actively on Russian troops here, which means that those anti-air Russian systems and radars, for the most part, were destroyed, and there is no effective anti-air defense over the Kherson bridgehead at this point. So the tactic of Ukrainian troops has changed. They were essentially forced to slow down in frontal attacks that lead to heavy losses. So the way it works right now, it looks like this is at least our best sort of assessment, best educated guess is that now they're using Bayraktars to pick up Russian artillery, like individual pieces, the most sort of dangerous 152 millimeter ones, destroy them, and then Ukrainian infantry and armor moves forward, basically, right? So they use Bayraktars to kind of clear up the most dangerous obstacles. And then they try to continue moving. So that sort of relatively probably new tactic relative to the first days, where it's more like frontal, just like frontal push and desire to sort of just gain ground and achieve objectives at all costs. The offensive has not fizzled out. Based on what we're seeing, it just kind of like changed a little bit the tactics on the ground, as we discussed about these Bayraktars. So so that really means it's gonna take longer, slower, and so on. But we discussed this before, that uh, the writing is on the wall for the Russian troops here on Kherson bridgehead, um, and given that Ukrainian troops don't have skills, don't have um, proper middle level and upper level commanders, it's extremely hard for them to execute any offensive in the first place. And we can see that it's extremely poorly executed. Nevertheless, they managed to still push through, mostly based on on the soldiers' morale and their desire to sort of move forward and to achieve objectives. The same is actually going true for the Russian side. Basically, the Russian troops are holding on only thanks to those airborne units and special forces brigade, which basically also holding on based on their sort of motivation, because they don't have overwhelming Russian artillery support or even air support. So it's kind of like turning into more even fight, where it's more infantry versus infantry, and tanks and all of that. Sort of typical, more sort of what the people think about the war, basically. And this sort of remains to be seen how it's all going to play out, because eventually the Russian troops here are going to get worn out, because we're talking about basically 3 regiments of 7th Airborne Division and 2 regiments of 98th, and then small Special Forces Brigade, which is really small. It's at this point it's probably less than 1,000 soldiers, probably more like 700 to 500. So eventually this will crack, and it looks like Ukrainian command has still firepower to keep the pressure, and there's no reason not just to stop the pressure, because it's also obvious on the Ukrainian side that Russian troops are trapped here. So you just need to keep the pressure to kind of like cook the frog. So let's see actually what's going on first here on this kind of like most western section, where there is actually nothing really new. So this is near Snihorivka. This is the front line, more or less the same. Nothing really, no changes. This straight between Mykolaiv, which is here, and then Kherson is here. This is the circular road around Kherson. So those were counterattacks we discussed, and the situation here totally stabilized. Nothing really new to sort of update or report. Just basically local fighting, but no real movements. Let's put this way here by other side. There is sort of the most promising part, and as we discussed before, is this in the center, south of the Davydiv Brid, basically between Snihorivka and the Davydiv Brid. And this one is northern situation is somewhat promising, but it's more of tying up 98th Airborne Division and 45th Special Forces Brigade, so they cannot come kind of south and help out stemming this advance here, which is the most promising at this point. The same point here is Ukrainian troops putting pressure on this most western section to keep the 7th Airborne Division engaged here, so it doesn't go back and doesn't stop this advance here. So based on our information, the only sort of real stopping force is the 217th Regiment. That's because this 205th Brigade and 126th Brigade, they sort of, let's say, conditionally capable of any significant defensive action. So they really, to extent, we can call them as a write-off. But so this is what's stopping so far Ukrainian defenses. And let's actually look how it was playing out. So the initial move was towards this village to Stavok, which was captured. Then Ukrainian troops managed to get into Bruskinsky. However, they were counterattacked by Russian airborne units. and they were squeezed out of Bruskinsky, and so they kind of like straight, like right sort of outside of this village on the western outskirts of it. Then they decided to pivot kind of like towards south, which is actually anyways where they need to go. So they captured this village Kostromka, and apparently there was no Russian troops here because 98th division is kind of like up north. So this 217th regiment probably came kind of like from north, so it kind of managed to keep this road from Davidiv Brid to Bereslav kind of like under control. I mean, it's technically under control, but it's not usable because Ukrainian troops right there, and so they have fire control over the road. But nevertheless, they stemmed the advances of Ukrainian troops here towards, kind of like towards east. But the whole point was to capture this road and start moving along this road T-2207 towards Bereslav, which also means Nova Kakhovka. So what Ukrainian troops did, then they kind of pivoted again from Kostromka to Schaslyve, so basically kind of started moving south, and they captured this village Schaslyve, and that was sort of achievement for today. Not really much, given the whole situation, but as we said, the whole offensive has slowed down significantly, and what because of the losses. So apparently, Ukrainian command trying to sort of minimize the losses, and what they do, they trying to pick up those Russian artillery pieces that creating problems for Ukrainian advances with the help of Bayraktars. Russian troops also put some screening troops here. We don't know what sort of unit it is here. Probably also airborne 217th regiment, we would assume, but we don't have sort of any kind of confirmation here. So this is sort of kind of like the move so far. We don't know what's going on here, if this was cleared out, this whole kind of like a peninsula controlled by Russian troops. We would presume so, because this was basically, it's kind of like screening, even I would say third-rated troops from the Donetsk region, those forced conscripts. They have basically provisional sort of military value, basically. So we would assume that they evacuated this, but we don't have confirmation for that. We also seen information that Ukrainian troops tried to do frontal attack here in Davidiv Brid, which failed, and that actually kind of a little bit surprising sort of information. But as you can see, the what is happening right now is Ukrainian troops are trying to kind of like find the path of least resistance, but with the main direction is kind of like going into the southeast, basically along this road that you see here, T-2207, because this is the road to Nova Kakhovka. Essentially, this is where the sort of end goal here is. Now let's move what's going on here in the north. Things here are, this is the initial moves here. As you can see, the most sort of dangerous situation was that Ukrainian troops managed to sort of penetrate Russian defenses south of Vysokopilya. Here they were not successful. Then on the next day, Ukrainian troops managed to capture Arkhangelsky and increase their sort of bridgehead here, past this some kind of water channel here, and essentially kind of like semi-encircle this 45th Special Forces Brigade here. Right now, this actual situation here is unclear. Looks like Russian troops managed to escape and lost both villages, but then in other reports they say that they counterattacked here and managed to kind of create firm kind of corridor to these two villages. So the situation here is somewhat unclear at this point. What is clear is that Ukrainian troops still holding on to Arkhangelsky, which essentially makes it problematic to hold on to both villages, to hold on to Olhine and Vysokopilya in the long run. But the bigger picture of all of this is holding on this 331st Regiment of 98th Airborne Division and 45th Special Forces Brigade, so they cannot go south and they cannot stop Ukrainian troops that are advancing there, or let's say slowly but advancing so far. So this is all for today. Thanks for watching, and until tomorrow. Bye bye.